Welcome to A Game of Ice and Fire, a video series devoted to a Song of Ice and Fire wargame by Coolman or Not. We cover all aspects of the hobby with tactics and list build videos, painting tutorials of varying levels, and battle reports. In this video, we're going to be talking about some Freefolk Raider list building and tactics from the Mance Rayder commanded perspective. Before we get into the list build for a Mance Rayder-led Freefolk army, I do want to touch on the Freefolk base tactic cards and just the general concept that comes with playing Freefolk as we know them right now, which would just be with their starter box and the Spearwives. Cave Dwellers are just on the cusp of release, and we do have their rules, but I'm going to leave them out of this video just to focus on what we're dealing with right now in terms of what's available in the wild. Now, Freefolk are so unique once you start playing them. Many of us have probably played other war games where there's like the Hoard style army where you're just trying to crush your opponent through weight of dice and terrible stats, or which I think is really just what Hoard armies typically would do. You might have a few big things that are being screened by the little stuff that your opponent's got to chew through until you unpack your big bad guys, right? The Freefolk kind of have some of that going with them when you at least look at their models. Like the Freefolk Raiders and Trappers are dirt cheap, and then you've got these big giants. So we would think it's kind of like how some of the other games we might have played work, where you just are trying to get the army's just a delivery system for that big thing that you're working on, but that's not quite how the Freefolk work, at least in how I've been playing them. So before I start getting into some circular logic or just keep going over the same thing over and over again, let's look at some of the tactics cards for the Freefolk. The first one we're going to come across is Surrounded and Exposed. This one triggers at the start of any turn. You can target one enemy combat unit. If you have two or more friendly units within short range of that enemy then loses all abilities that turn. If you control the maneuver position on the tactics board, you can also give the enemy a condition of your choice. So very straightforward card, just shuts down a unit when you, and it has start at any turn, so it can be a very proactive card or a reactive card. Just fairly simple that you got a bunch of dudes around stuff, and if you've got them close enough, you can anticipate that charge and kind of make it hurt a little bit less. The next one we're going to look at is Regroup and Reform. This triggers when a friendly infantry unit activates. You can remove up to 4 models total from other friendly infantry units within long range. Then you restore that many wounds to the unit you've targeted. If you control the maneuver tactics board position, you can restore 2 additional wounds. So this is nice in being able to maybe take a unit that's been dug in for a while that you're trying to keep there, or you're trying to get a unit back up to like charging potential, or at least max output on their charging potential. This is like one of the better, I guess, stalling or wound restoration tactics that we have access to as Freefolk. The next card we'll go into is Distraction Tactics. When an enemy unit makes a melee attack, that unit suffers -1 to hit for each enemy engaged unit beyond the first. Sorry, I messed that one up. That unit suffers -1 to hit for each enemy engaged with them beyond the first. So this is probably at least the only time I've been able to use this card and get actual like value out of it. I've never had anything more than 2 in terms of units engaged with an enemy at a time. So getting the -1 to hit can help, especially if you're going into some of those more elite units and you're dug into them and they're not getting the charge. Then you don't have to worry about the rerolls, because if you're going from a 3 to a 4 with rerolls on the charge, it's not really doing a whole lot for you. Plus, you'd have to be positioned just perfectly for you to be engaged with 2 of your units, or your opponent's gotta not be making the best move, I think. Because when you charge, you just like charge 100%, and you're not aligned with both units. So this is once you're in the mix card, you get value out of it. Next up, we've got Swift Advance. Now, this is just a Stark card, or has appeared in the Stark deck, so it's nice to see at least that they're not afraid to reuse tactics cards. This one triggers when a friendly infantry unit activates. That infantry unit may make a free maneuver action. If you control the tactics or the maneuver position on the tactics board, the unit also gains +1 speed and may reroll any charge dice this activation. Swift Advance is good for this army in that it's not that the army is slow, it's somewhat respectable. Most of it's, between 5 and 6. At least I don't recall any units that are speed 4 right now. But being able to get a giant up the table if you need to unpack it into something, or get a Freefolk Raider unit into the side where where they might be able to do some damage, or Spearwives where they could get into the side of someone and just obliterate them. Plus, this lets you get some long bomb charges that you might not have got before, and more recently I've been trying to utilize it to get on objectives early to stop my opponent from getting them. So Swift Advance is just a great card for any melee-centric army. This way you also it becomes less of a problem getting clumped up on your own unit trays, because that is a very real thing that can happen with this army. Next up, we have There's Too Many. When an enemy combat unit activates, if there are 2 more enemies engaged with that unit, they suffer a panic test with -2 to their roll. So I don't like saying that each deck kind of has a dud card in it, but I feel like this is the dud card of the Freefolk army. There isn't a lot right now that messes with the panic test. I think the cave dwellers have vicious as a rule, so this would stack with it, so you could put a really big zap on someone if you have a unit or more in there. But there's only 2 of these in the deck, so it's just more of a, when it comes up and can happen, it's cool card. It's kind of a nice way to try and get some extra wounds across with panic test. You can zap somebody to drop an egg if you're playing on Dance with Dragons. But this is a card I probably, if it were in my hand at the end of a turn, I would have no problem discarding this, because I'm not gonna, the opportunities that I will be able to use it and get a lot of benefit out of it is kind of slim. It'll be a cool when it happens card type of thing, not something you should be trying to play for. Then we have Group Assault. When a friendly unit makes a melee attack, if there is another friendly unit engaged with that enemy, this attack gains critical blow and sundering. So this card I really have come to appreciate quite a bit in the army. The Freefolk don't have a ton of ways to punch armor outside of the 2 power player units, in my opinion. And this card turns a Freefolk Raider unit into something that can actually put some meaningful damage out. And if your Spearwives happen to be engaged and there's no way to get them out of it, then this could get that sundering back in, and they roll enough dice to where critical blow actually feels like you're doing something with it. On a giant, this isn't going to do much of anything. You don't care about it at all. It's not a good card for them. But I think as more units come out, Group Assault's going to be a much more important card. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the followers of Bone look like, in hopes that this card can work for them too. The last card, which I didn't intend for it to be the last one, but I think it's one of the most powerful ones in the deck, is the Endless Hoard. When you claim a tactic zone, you can replace that zone's effect with redeploy 1 previously destroyed Freefolk infantry unit into a friendly deployment zone. Attachments are not returned with that unit. If you control the maneuver position, they're deployed without an activation token. Otherwise, they gain 1 activation token. So having the maneuver position is something that this army is going to want to do a lot, because all of its cards in the base tactics deck that can get better with holding a tactics board position are going to get it from the maneuver position. So the generic tactics deck itself has a few cards that can help forward the combat presence on the table, but I think as a Freefolk player, I think you're tilting the game, you're tilting your chances of winning the game much more in your favor if you hit 2 endless hordes in a game. And this can do really neat things like bring back a raider unit and to charge a enemy unit in the butt if they've gotten into your ranks at all and have started trying to carve the back out, or getting your high value units like Spearwives, or I know I'm not trying to talk about cave dwellers, but cave dwellers are kind of a high value unit. Any Freefolk infantry that comes out is going to be able to get placed by that card. So you think about building a 40-point army, you're always going to be playing between 40 or 52 and 50 points up, or not up, but at least that'll be your point level when you factor in Endless Horde. So the Freefolk in general, as I had said earlier, we're mostly used to Horde armies in war games being more weight of dice. Like, we throw a bunch of dice at you and that's how we kill you. Sometimes we roll a bunch of good hits and sometimes we don't. And that's just the risk that you play with the Horde army. But the Freefolk Raiders, like the core unit of the Freefolk army, they don't have enough dice to make it feel like that's what you're doing. It takes you, I mean, maybe they do, but 2 units will equal 12 dice when they're full ranks. But they don't have any real combat tricks other than hitting better if you've got more than one engaged with you, and playing the card that gives Sundering and Crit Blow on a unit that's only rolling 6 dice kind of feels bummy. But I think that the Freefolk army tries to overwhelm you through activations and strange positioning tactics. So when you're playing against a Stark player or something like that, somebody who's playing some high value units like Berserkers or Great Axes, when they decide to unpack their army and get a charge on Freefolk, they're almost assuredly giving up a flank to another Freefolk Raider charge. And now that 6 dice hitting on the rerollable 3s with the neg-1 armor and neg-1 to your panic test seems like they're a little bit more punching above their point class in terms of only being a 3-point unit. So I think that the Freefolk take a lot of finesse in order to figure out how to play, and I think you're going to have a hard, if you're used to the other armies in terms of playing them, you're going to have a hard time getting used to being completely alright losing like 3 units before the middle of the game, or more even. So it's more like the Freefolk Raiders are just, you have to trade them or dig them into something, or maybe you might just not get a charge off and you're trying to, you'll have to accept a charge from your opponent, just because Freefolk Raiders, in addition to rolling dice to hit things like any other normal combat unit would, they also can act as speed bumps to stop your opponent from getting to where they want to be. So I think that I have some battle reports coming up with Freefolk to kind of show what I'm talking about, because it is very difficult to conceptualize the Freefolk style of play and then iterate it through this video and have you interpret it the way that I'm thinking it. So definitely look out for those to get more of a feel of how I utilize the Freefolk. But as some advice to any blooming Freefolk players or new Freefolk players out there, don't get discouraged if you're losing a bunch of games right away or losing a bunch of models right away. I think that you're definitely going to lose more games when you win, when you're trying to figure out what the army does. When you're starting with something like Stark Lannisters or Night Watch, you can sometimes just accidentally win games because your combat output's really good, your panic tests are, scoring nuts, or you're just healing so much with Night's Watch that your opponent can't keep up with you. But with Freefolk, you really need to have your head in the game when you're looking at it, and those tactics cards, even though they're really good, I don't think there's a lot that they're doing for you that's really apparent. You really have to be intricate in what you do with those tactics cards. You can't utilize something like Sudden Charge the way a Stark player would, where you're just trying to get the extra distance to get that charge because, sweet, you just threw down Swift Advance and got your Freefolk Raider into this unit of, Lannister Guard or something super early. That's a bad example. We'll say like Mountainsmen or something. But like you're only throwing 6 dice. There's no combat tricks because you're the only one engaged with them. So you're not really gaining a whole lot by utilizing something like Swift Advance that way. You kind of have to play this strange game where you're just like you kind of want to crash into your opponent all at once and then try and waterfall the weird stuff from there, like getting into the flanks and trying to block them off from objectives, things like that. So I think I've kind of hit as much as I want to with the Freefolk concept of how they approach the table enough to where now I feel like I can move into Mance Rayder's tactics cards, and these really shift the way the deck kind of is presented to us, because when you look at the deck without these tactics cards, it really does change a ton as compared to any other faction out there, in my opinion. So the first card we're going to look at for Mance Rayder, King Beyond the Wall, is Wildling Diplomacy. When an enemy NCU activates, you select 2 zones on the tactics board. If that NCU claims either zone this activation, you can deal 1 enemy combat unit D3 plus 2 wounds. If that enemy combat unit is within short range of Mance Rayder, they also gain 1 condition token of your choice. So the Freefolk army, with how it builds out, can usually fit 2 NCUs in there, and for sure that's all you can fit right now, because if you're playing with Mance Rayder as your commander, you've lost your 3rd NCU option. So if you suck the activations out of your opponent early by getting your tactics board set up, which is pretty easy to do early, where you put like Valencraster on the maneuver and tactics board position, so you, or the missive or whatever, you can get your 2 activations out right away, let your opponent slam down their second one free, and then hold this Wildling Diplomacy to trap them into just zapping a unit for D3 plus 2 wounds. It's definitely not a very I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not a card that you can just burn super early. You've got to really hold it and wait for the right moment to get it. Sometimes you can read what your opponent is wanting to do with the tactics board when they've got like 3 open options, so you can kind of play this on them and force them to take the bad option to try and just get them out of making a good activation, even if it's going to cost them anywhere from 3 to 5 wounds in a condition. So definitely a lot of situational variants to how you would utilize this card. Next up, we have Predictable Maneuvers. This triggers at the start of an enemy turn. It's not that it triggers, it just has certain requirements. It's not quite like a trigger, but at the start of an enemy turn, if they have 2+ unactivated combat units, so it's a trigger. It just doesn't feel like one, in my opinion. But once that condition's met, target 1 enemy combat unit. If that enemy activates this turn before they perform an action, 1 friendly unit may make a free action. If that enemy is within short range of Mance Rayder, they also gain 1 condition token. So this is another one of these like messing with your opponent's activations deal. If you've got 2 units that are engaged with another where your opponent's probably going to want to carve through those first, you can play this when they have fewer options on the table and force them into an activation that's not as good. Just another card where you have to kind of bide your time and pick the right moment to use it. The last one that Mance gives us is Meticulous Planning. At the start of a friendly turn, you can discard this card and 1 other tactics card to search your tactics deck for 1 card and put it into your hand. After that, you shuffle your library. So this one is it kind of blows to say that you're trading 2 tactics cards for 1, but as I had mentioned earlier with the base tactics decks, or the base tactics deck, there are a few potato draws that you'll end up getting depending on what point in the game you're at or what's going on. So you'll usually have something that isn't super necessary in your hand, so you can trade that and this card to go get one that you actually want. It's not a terrible card. It sounds like it's got a really bad upfront cost to it, but with having Craster to get you extra card, or get you extra card each turn, and having access to the tactics position, because playing against someone who doesn't want you to turn on some of your other cool stuff for Freefolk, especially if you're using Lady Val and want to get 2 maneuvers out of it, they'll probably try and take that maneuver position whenever they can, just to try and make things a little bit more difficult for you. At least this way you've got access to that missive location, so you can draw extra cards that way and can fuel meticulous planning. So in general, the Mance Rayder tactic card set, it's not like how we would think. Well, I can't say that either. You would think that Mance Raiders, like, yeah, we're gonna be super combat focused and very like tactically sharp, but a lot of his stuff is much like his character in the novels and the TV series. He's very slow to make very specific and hard strikes, so you kind of have to play the army like that when you're using Mance Rayder. It just lets you don't have a whole lot of tricks on the table, so you've got to utilize the ones on your hand. It's really got this idea that you're working with what you've got. You're not really utilizing any great big combat prowess or political sharpness in order to take the game over. You're really just working with just some patience, really, is what I guess I could say about it. So the first place to start out with on any Freefolk list is how many Freefolk Raiders do you want in it. So, oh, you know what? We got to back it up here. Mance Rayder also has his attachment card, which I kind of wanted to talk about first, as opposed to some of the other ways I've done these where I talk about them last. So Mance Rayder is a unit attachment in his commander version. He has Inspiring Presence, so this unit's morale becomes 6+, and then he has the Rally Point ability that says friendly units within short range of Mance Rayder's unit can use his morale stat for their morale tests. So one of the things you'll notice about Freefolk when you first start looking over their cards is that their morale is typically horrible. There's only a few units in here that are really stand out in terms of, and I mean, it's not even that great, to be honest, but their morale really blows, so you'll have a hard time sticking in the game if you're taking these panic tests and losing a lot out of it, especially if you're doing something like you've got corpse piles next to you, you're playing Feast of Crows, or against Lannisters, where if they, crown zap you with Cersei, you're probably looking at always failing that roll. I think you would get boxcars, you'd pass it, but the morale stats on them is pretty low. So having Mance Rayder in the middle of kind of the business, because your army isn't going to be spreading out a whole bunch. I mean, they're not going to be all within 6 inches of him, but you're going to kind of come in this one crashing wave, at least in the way that I've been playing Freefolk. So now that I've got Mance Rayder's attachment card out of the way, I do want to talk about what kind of unit I want to put him on. Now remember, I've said we're only utilizing the 3 combat units that are really out right now that he could possibly go in, and that would be Freefolk Raiders, Spearwives, or Freefolk Trappers. So Freefolk Raiders are throwaway units. You are strategically thrown away, but they're going to get into combat, and your expectation is that they will die. They're not going to influence anyone if they're not doing anything in combat other than just getting in the way of things. But I don't want Mance Rayder just getting in the way of things. I kind of want him in the mix, influencing stuff while still having somewhat of a buffer around him. So the best way I think to do that is with a shooting unit. And the Spearwives do have a ranged attack, but they also want to be charging a lot. So I don't want to put Mance Rayder in that unit because he could very well just be the focus of my opponent to scalpel Mance Rayder out so that he can start, even if they're not a army that's really centered on panic tests, they can still drop the crown on us and then start hurting units quite a bit that way. So the last unit that leaves us with right now is the Freefolk Trappers, and I'm pretty good with putting them in there. They're speed 6, so they're maneuverable and can get to where they need to if some morale tests need to be or are being taken more frequently than other spots. They do have a short range weapon, which is not amazing if you're trying to have things in front of you, but it is something you can at least influence the table with a little bit. The big reason to put him in here is because they've got the order for the hidden traps, and hidden traps says when a unengaged enemy unit within long range moves, the enemy suffers D3 wounds and triggers a disorderly charge on a 1 or a 2. So this is something that Mance can use to where his unit can influence a little bit more of the table, and getting the 1 or 2 for the disorderly charge with that order is really good for this army because I don't want my opponent hitting very accurately when it comes to my Freefolk Raiders. If they're coming into my line, I want to keep them there as long as possible if I'm in a strategically beneficial position. So we do stick Mance Rayder in a unit of Freefolk Trappers, and while we're on it, we're going to bring a second unit of Freefolk Trappers with this list, just so that we can have one on each side of the table in case my opponent has any dire wolves or other monsters that I need to keep an eye out for. This way I can trigger those D3 wounds on them. In addition, being speed 6 is really good for getting onto objectives early while the rest of your army just kind of runs on by and gets into the business. So far, Mance Rayder with 2 Freefolk Trappers. Now to get back to what I was saying earlier, I think the first place you want to start after you've got that garbage figured out is how many Freefolk Raiders do I want to run. Now, I've seen some concepts for lists put together where you can run, your 2 Freefolk Raider units and then a bunch of other like high-priced stuff in the Freefolk army, but I think the bare minimum for any Freefolk army is to run 4 units of Freefolk Raiders, and that's where I'm going to be starting with this list. I want to play the type of game with Freefolk Raiders where I can run them forward and not really care what happens to them because another unit's going to be right behind them. I don't want to give them all to my opponent at the same time. I want to stagger them so I can start, charging in and getting some flanks, or just being able to get 2 units engaged so I can trigger some of those other cards that I've got in the tactics deck. So I think 4 is a good place to start here. And with the Freefolk Raiders, we need to talk about the Freefolk Raid Leader. Now, he has the ability Combined Assault. When this unit activates, target 1 friendly unactivated unit within long range. It activates immediately after this unit and can only charge the unit that it attacked this turn. So I think that having 4 raid leaders is just not, or having a raid leader on each unit is really not quite the way to go, because you're only going to be able to utilize half of them at any given time because the original one would have charged, and you can only put so many units on another unit. So being able to get 3 of these off on an opponent or 2 of these off on an opponent is going to be pretty rare. So with this list, I've kind of taken a more buffet style approach to it. I've taken 1 raid leader to put on 1 Freefolk unit so that I can get at least 1, or Freefolk Raider unit so that I can at least get 1 double activation if I need it. I haven't really tried to go for this opportunity, but it is a nice way of trying to turn on the gang up ability for the Freefolk Raiders. So it just gives me another interesting way to apply them. In the future, I might try and run more of these, but right now I'm just experimenting with the one. Now, I do want some of the more business units in the army. So Freefolk Raiders and Freefolk Trappers, they are very, like, normal, right? They don't do anything too spectacular. They kind of forward this notion of the army just being more rush forward style, get chunked up on bodies. So I want to be able to run some units that can help dig some raiders out of a bad situation, or clear the raiders off so that they can dig deeper when they need to. So for this purpose, I'm going to run one unit of Spearwives. They're speed 5, so they're not horribly slow, but not super fast either. The good thing with them is that most of your free folk units are going to get worse, much worse as they lose ranks, but the Spearwives are kind of self-maintaining in that they roll the same amount of dice whether they're at 1 or 2 ranks, and on both attack profiles too, whether it's melee or close or ranged. So they roll 7, 7, and 3 across both their stat lines. They hit on 4s, no, regardless of which one. They've got a decent morale, at least at 7, so you don't have to babysit them a bunch with making sure weirwoods are all over the place. But the problem with them is they do have they're a source of sundering in the list, but it's not constant. It's only when they charge. So we are going to want to use them as the follow-up. Like the Freefolk Raider will get engaged. Maybe they'll put some attacks through and kill a couple models, but then the Spearwives will come in, do a ton of work on them on the flank, and then hopefully clear the raiders off so that we can start pushing those raiders further, and just kind of rinse and repeat with that whole process again. So another thing I've opted to do with the unit is put a Spearwife Matriarch on them in this list, and I do appreciate the order that she brings, at least in terms of Stark Outriders. They're kind of beefy, and they can take those hits and back up and still be able to utilize them. Because like cavalry just they have their 2 ranks, but they've got 6 wounds on that first rank, so it's a little bit harder to chew through them. Whereas with these, I guess the Free Folk Spearwives kind of have the same gist with them. It takes you 8 wounds to get to their worst attack stat, so having that retreat on there is you'll be able to utilize it for sure. With this list, I could see you taking the Matriarch out and putting another raid leader in, just so you have 2 Freefolk Raider units that can activate in tandem. But for right now, I don't mind the Spearwife Matriarch, in that you're going to be able to keep applying the sundering without having to utilize the tactics board. So I do bring 1 giant in this list, just to give me a semi-maneuverable, really hurdy piece. Kind of fulfills the same role as the Spearwives do. With its mighty swing, all you have to do is hit with this thing on a 2+, so on the charge it works. And I'm sure many of you have been through the FAQ thing, to where if the hit's blocked, it still generates a hit, so you do all that. But if you're not familiar with that, go to Cool Miniornaut's website for A Song of Ice and Fire and look at the Freefolk FAQ, because there's a lot of information in there about how to utilize giants right now. So if you don't know about the FAQ shenanigans with them, just familiarize yourself with that, because it's very eye-opening in terms of what can be done with a giant that's really unique and what can be done to a giant that really sucks. Yeah, having a 7-point unit roll 1 die and doing nothing really blows. So definitely make sure you're aware of that if you're trying to take any of these, 3 or more giant lists. But the giants they're pretty survivable. They've got 5 wounds that save at a 4+, and they for every 2 unblocked hits, they only take 1. So they're likely to get their other portion of Mighty Swing to trigger, where they get to do extra wounds depending on how many wounds they've actually taken throughout the game. So it's not easy to one-shot these giants. You just have to make sure you don't unpack them into something where they're more likely to get shredded really quick. That's what your Freefolk Raiders are for. Like if you're putting them, if you have a unit of Freefolk Raiders staring down the barrel of some Night's Watch Sworn Brothers, and then your giants next to him, you're probably going to want to unpack that Freefolk Raider unit and then send the giant elsewhere so he doesn't have to worry about going into that Sundering unit that's just going to tear him down, because they hit accurately and they can keep attacking they will keep attacking at a decent rank with all the healing they've got going on. So that rounds out the bulk of our list in terms of units, and I am running 2 NCUs with the rest of the points. It is going to be Lady Val and Craster. Now, Lady Val is a really important piece to this army. When she claims a tactics zone on the tactics board, you can replace its effect with the maneuver effect instead. Now, that doesn't mean you get to be considered controlling the maneuver tactics position, so your cards won't turn on if you put Lady Val on something like the coin tactics board position. The nice thing about this is that you can get 2 maneuvers a turn by claiming the original one with Craster and claiming another one with her. Lets you block your opponent so you don't have to be so thrifty when it comes to wanting to do what you want to do. You can just take what they have and get what you want. It's kind of like a weird single version of, or linear version of Littlefinger, I guess. And Craster is good for this list in that he can restore wounds to your big power player units like your giants and your Spearwives. I don't see myself putting units back into a Freefolk Raider, a Trapper unit, unless something like Mance has taken some wounds and I just want to buff his unit back up. But getting the extra tactics card is good. Having access to as many of these as you can, or as many of the tactics cards as you can for Freefolk, is important. And not so much that the cards themselves are really good, but it's more so that you just want to try and hit Endless Hoard not as early as possible, but you want to make sure you have access to it, because I do think that the success of a Freefolk player is really pumped up by hitting both of those. If you're a newer Freefolk player, I almost said Furfolk, but if you're a newer Freefolk player, try this list out. It kind of takes a sample of everything that's available in the army. Getting used to playing Mance's cards is going to be a bit difficult, but it does really support this idea of how the army is supposed to play, and that you're kind of positioning in the right way to take certain things when you're able to, and not necessarily to rip them off the table right away. You're more so biding your time to make key decisions that will influence the rest of the game. As I was adding images to this clip, I realized that I forgot about one of the most important rules on the Freefolk Raiders and Trappers, and that's Insignificant. This rule just states that this unit is not worth victory points through the victory through combat condition. So the thing about playing Freefolk is that you're going to try and slow roll the objective. It's very difficult for you to win by just tabling your opponent, because it just doesn't, unless everything goes amazingly well or you're playing a very different list, you're just not going to get there as quickly. You're not getting those big alpha strikes and wiping things out really early through your amazing combat prowess. Like if the stars align properly, you could do it. I mean, a good Freefolk player against someone who's not respecting their positioning, it could work out. But for the most part, you're just going to attrition to the victory condition, which would be the scenario. Having Insignificant allows you to do things like throw your Freefolk Raiders around all willy-nilly and not worry about endless hordes giving your opponent extra victory points. I did not want to end this video without mentioning that piece, because it is extremely important that you understand how to play the scenario with Freefolk in order to have consistent victories, and making sure that you're not worried about this idea of victory through combat is really important. Plus, if you get too used to the Insignificant rule, you'll forget things like the giants aren't insignificant, nor are the Spearwives or Cave Dwellers when they come out. hope you enjoyed this tactics discussion on Freefolk in general and a Mance Rayder-led army. If you did, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click on the notification bell to be alerted whenever I put out new videos. If you would like, I have a Facebook page for Big Top Gaming. I post a lot of updates there on just what's going on with my hobbying. When Adepticon happens, I'll probably post a lot of updates there as well. And if the concepts in the video were a little bit too hard for me to get across, I have a battle report coming out very soon with this list in it, so keep an eye out for that, and you'll be able to see how some of my ideas on how to play Freefolk kind of translate onto the table that way without having to bash your head against it until you've got it settled or figured out. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I enjoy making it, and I look forward to doing the next one for you.